Hello, it's Regina. Welcome back to my haunted library. Today, I'm finally doing another Robert McKee story video. I started this playlist back in the summer, and I have to finish something once I start. So I am picking it up. I am on chapter 12, composition. So composition means the ordering and linking of scenes. Like a composer chewing notes and chords, we shape progressions by selecting what to include, to exclude, to put before and after what. So I find this is really fascinating because this really speaks to the creative process and kind of the mystery of the creative process. Like, how do you know? How do you know why that works? It's not something that I think you can really learn in a book. It really is honed by your talent and your experience, your ear, with just the same way a musician would just know that that's wrong in that spot. You feel it. You know, there's a lot of like decisions based on just intuition or just feeling, but that comes from experience. It's not just, I mean, I do believe a lot of it is innate, but that is something that you can work on. Okay, so he goes on, the task can be harrowing, for as we come to know our subject, every story possibility seems alive and squirming in a different direction. The disastrous temptation is to somehow include them all. And I wrote Tolkien in the margin, only because I had been reading Lord of the Rings, and at times I felt like Tolkien could have used a little editing, but, you know, that was just me being frustrated probably. So, unity and variety, pacing, rhythm, and tempo, social and personal progression, symbolic and ironic ascension, and the principle of transition. So these are the things that he addresses. So, unity and variety. A story, even when expressing chaos, must be unified. The biggest turnoff, I think, to any kind of written work, if you're reading fiction, let's say, unless you're trying to have an abstract experience, which for me, it doesn't really work in fiction. Abstract art, yes, you're dealing with different input of information, a different stimulus. But a fictional work has to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you lose your reader. You know, no one wants to read something that doesn't make sense. Challenging, yes. You know, if you're trying to read James Joyce, Ulysses, some people would say that doesn't make sense, but it's been proved that it does make sense. It's just difficult. Or makes sense on different levels. I've never read it. I have read James Joyce, though, but not that work. All right. We should sense a causal lock between inciting incident and story climax. So there has to be a through line. And so often, and I hate to pick on these young adult books, but I'm going to, that seems to be missing in a lot of these YA books. And I don't know if it's because they're a series and they're setting up the next book, but I'm seeing a definite lack of like solid through line, which the old craftsmen, like the old, not that I'm going to call them old, but I mean classic, like someone like Dean Koontz. You know, he's written hundreds and hundreds of books by now probably. He's a craftsman. He knows this. He knows how to do that. The inciting incident is the story's most profound cause, and therefore the final effect, the story climax, should seem inevitable. The cement that binds them is the spine. That's the through line. The protagonist's deep desire to restore the balance of life. So, variety. Change it up to keep it interesting. Don't hit the same note. Just like in a good work of music, I keep going back to music, you're going to have your soft spots, you're going to have your staccato, you're going to have your adagios. If it's all one note, it's going to get very boring. When you're reading, you want to have that breathing room. You don't want every scene to be like hitting at a 10. You know, you want to have those peaks and valleys. That keeps it interesting. And that is another thing that a writer, you feel out, or you can do it kind of by the book, and this book does tell you how to do that. And then he gets into pacing. Because a story is a metaphor for life, we expect it to feel like life, to have the rhythm of life. So it's not always going to be like the action scenes or the battle scenes. Like in The Lord of the Rings, in a good way. I was kind of getting frustrated with all the, Hobbit eating scenes. They did a lot of walking, and then they would eat, and walk some more, and then they would eat. But those scenes helped me to get to know those characters, and it gave me a comforting feeling. So then when they didn't have any food, I felt their pain. And then, they would have like a big battle scene, and they would, be all in all kinds of trouble. So there was that rhythm and that pacing. What else? Well, again, breaks and breathers. We need to have those little breaks. Tighten and release while building to the final climax. He talks about tighten and release, tighten and release. It's kind of like a love affair, You don't want it to all be roses. It's got to be some tighten and release. In fact, he just, this is how my mind works. He just says this here. It's just like sex. Masters of the bedroom arts pace their lovemaking. Good to know. The gracious storyteller makes love to us. In other words, you don't want to reach the climax too soon in your story or in the bedroom. All right, rhythm and tempo, long scenes, short scenes. I like it when there's like a little bit of, even in my horror stories, I try to throw a little comedy in there too. A little, a few little jokes. Like within the character. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but a little comic relief never hurt anything. He talks about this idea of French scenes, which are like sub-locations within, like in the old French theater, they would have like this, the entire play would take place in like a manor house, but there would be little sections in that house, which are the French scenes. He mentions one of my favorite movies, My Dinner with Andre, which all takes place in a restaurant with two characters just having dinner and talking. If you've never seen this movie, you need to watch it. It's amazing. But Andre Gregory's character, who's playing himself, and Wallace Shawn playing himself, takes you on into different scenes with his storytelling. He tells these incredible stories. So he also mentions here tempo. For example, lovers talking quietly from pillow to pillow may have low tempo. An argument in a courtroom, high tempo. A character staring out of a window coming to a vital life decision may have low tempo. A riot, high tempo. In a well-told story, the progression of scenes and sequences accelerates pace. So I think that's also important for your novel, or even a short story, a very small work, kind of has the same progressions. You can have these lulls, quiet scenes. They can still be extremely, and in fact they should be, significant. Then something, big happens, and then it kind of accelerates, builds to that climax. We want to feel that. I mean, even when I was reading Lord of the Rings, which you could say has a very slow story arc, Frodo's on a quest to throw the ring into Mount Doom. That's the entire goal of the three stories. How he gets there is a lot of this, but it still builds to that climax, and then we have the whole falling action of the Shire rebellion and all that stuff afterwards, which I didn't really feel like we needed, but I went with it. Okay, so what else? Like music and dance, story is kinetic. Climactic doesn't mean short and explosive, it means profound change. Again, the law of diminishing returns apply. The more often we pause, the less effective the pause is. So we want to build short scenes building to the climax. We don't want to stop the action, which I felt like in Lord of the Rings, the Shire rebellion kind of did. It's like Frodo reached the goal. Let's end it there. The eagles come in. They go back to the Shire. Everyone's happy. Big party. It didn't quite do that, but I felt like it could have, and it still would have been fun and fine. If we lengthen and slow scenes prior to a major reversal, we cripple our climax. Oh, I like this too. We must earn the pause. Expressing progression. When a story genuinely progresses, it calls upon greater and greater human capacity, demands greater and greater willpower. So all this applies to Lord of the Rings, very much so. Generates greater and greater change in characters' lives and places them at greater and greater jeopardy. How are we to express this? How will the audience sense the progression? And there are 4 primary techniques. So then he breaks it down. Social progression, widen the impact of characters' actions into society. He gives an example of Men in Black. He mentions Men in Black a lot, and I've never seen that movie. Whoops. Personal progression drives actions deeply into the intimate relationships and inner lives of the characters, which can be a great technique in a novel. You know, a novel can really, and in a lot of ways better than a film, can really get into somebody's internal conflict and how they resolve that. Emotional conflicts. Symbolic ascension. Build the symbolic charge of the story's imagery from the particular to the universal, the specific to the archetypal. That is a major feat, and Lord of the Rings does a good job with that. A good story well told fosters a good film, but a good story well told with the added power of subliminal symbolism lifts the telling to the next level of expressivity. And the payoff may be a great film or book. I think Lord of the Rings definitely achieves that. Like images in our dreams, it invades this unconscious mind and touches us deeply, as long as we're unaware of its presence. All right, well, I was a little aware, but I still really loved it. And then he uses for an example of how this works. He uses The Deer Hunter, which is a great movie, but he also uses one of my favorite movies of all time is The Terminator. I just feel like that is the perfect movie, perfect story. And this is what he says about this, or writes about this. The Terminator takes symbolic progression in a different direction, not up the mountain, but into the maze. Opening with step-down imagery of commonplace people in commonplace settings. It tells a story of Sarah Connor, a fast food waitress in Los Angeles. Suddenly the Terminator and Reese explode into the present from the year 2029 and pursue Sarah through the streets of LA, one trying to kill her, the other trying to save her. And then it goes on and on and on about the maze. The streets of Los Angeles conspire into the ancient archetype of the labyrinth. I think that is really interesting. Sarah progresses from waitress to goddess, and the film's symbolic progression lifts it above almost all others in its genre. I'm really glad that McKee wrote that about the Terminator, because I've always felt that about that film. And I think Alien does that too. It works. It's not just a great like horror film or action film. It works on a very deep archetypal level. And the Terminator does what so many action films never have been able to achieve, and that's a really great action, violent action film, and an amazing love story. Really combine the two. Like I probably watch that film at least once a year because I just love it so much. The Sarah Reese romance is amazing. And it's powerful. Oh, I just love it. All right, ironic ascension. Turn progression on irony. Irony plays between actions and results, the primary source of story energy, between appearance and reality, the primary source of truth and emotion. An ironic sensibility is a precious asset, a razor cut to the truth, but it can't be used directly. I think Woody Allen's films do a really good job with irony in a very funny way and in a very truthful way. All right, so then we get into different types of irony. It kind of goes on and on and on. The principle of transition. The third element is the hinge for transition, something held in common by two scenes or counterpointed between them. Learning how to do transitions in anything, I think, is also something that it's a skill, it's a technique. You learn from practice. You learn from training your senses, training your ear. Like in going back to music, the transition from one, part of the music to the other is so important. And in films, those transitions are really important. In storytelling, in fiction, those transitions are so important. So you have to think about like what gets me from this point to this point. It can be like a sudden change, or it can be subtle. It can be a comic moment. It can be a lot of different things. But as you're writing, you have to kind of decide, based on your feelings. I really think it does have a lot to do with feelings. And when I say feelings, I don't really mean emotions. It's just like, oh, this feels right. This is speaking to me. And you can develop that by reading a lot and writing and kind of figuring that out. I don't think you can really apply that much logic to it, although some people, it's funny, I was watching, my husband plays guitar, and he taught himself kind of to play by ear. And his brother, who is a scientist, is trying to also learn how to play guitar. So seeing how one person learns an instrument and is trying to figure out those transitions and the tempo and all those different things, it was a totally different approach from the person who's feeling it to the scientist who's trying to mathematically figure out, what's going on. I'm not saying that one approach is better than the other. I personally definitely more the feeling approach, but one can be very scientific about these things and also get a good result. When I'm reading something like Tolkien, obviously there's a very expressive mind at work there, but also an extremely high intellect at work there. And if you have both, I think you can have, you're in a good place. And you have to decide for yourself how you're going to approach these things. But yeah, another McKee chapter down. I'm going to keep going with this. I'm pretty close to the end. So I'll come back at some point with the next chapter. So let me know what you think. If you like McKee, it kind of was a little random on that chapter, but there's a lot there. So you really have to read it yourself. So if you have, comment below, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. And follow the Goodreads thread that no one is following, but maybe you'll find something in there for you. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon.